Hey everybody, thanks for joining me today on this webinar. Happy Friday. My name is Chimburi Sam, for those that don't know me. I'm a senior solutions architect here at Aikens IT, and I've been here for about 4 years now. My main area of expertise is really on the network infrastructure side of things, so that covers your usual routing, switching, wireless, as well as security appliances, and of course the public cloud on the network infrastructure side of things as well. Um, again, for today's webinar, the main topic is, deploying a NG firewall solution into your environment, whether that be a brand new Azure infrastructure that you just recently built out or an existing one. During today's webinar, I'm going to be approaching it from a fresh perspective. So we're going to be building out the actual network infrastructure, deploying VMs, Windows VMs, including the NG firewall security appliance that would secure that entire environment. Okay, so with that said here, we're gonna jump right in. So again, the title of our webinar today is Securing Your Azure Virtual Network with a NG Firewall Appliance. Okay, and NG Firewall just means that the firewall is able to do layer 7 filtering and has layer 7 visibility. So your application layer, right? So this gives you way more firepower and visibility into the type of traffic that's flowing in and out of your network, as well as what you can do with it, right? Your usual content filtering, web application, and so on. Okay, so here's going to be the topics we're covering today. So this webinar is going to be broken into 4 parts. The first being setting up a basic Azure network. Okay, so this again is going to be provisioning the actual virtual network, address spaces, carving out the subnets. And it's okay if you're not familiar with the Azure environment, that's completely fine. There are going to be some technical aspects of this webinar, but I'm going to do my best to keep it as high level as possible. And whether you recognize these processes or not, no worries. The main goal here is to show you how the NG firewall can be implemented in that environment to secure VMs within the Azure network, okay? So part 2 will be provisioning actual Azure Windows VMs. This is kind of to simulate a situation where you're having a hybrid setup, right? So you have your typical on-prem, or you have an actual physical data center, and you want to move not a full lift and shift, but just moving some of your infrastructure, slowly migrating it into the public cloud, or Azure in this case. So usually in that situation, you would deploy, domain controllers and DNS servers just to start off, right? So that's just to show you what that process will look like. Again, very high level. Part 3 would be deploying the actual NG firewall virtual appliance, okay, and what that process looks like. And then last but not least, part 4 would actually involve how traffic routes from the Azure network into the virtual appliance, security virtual appliance, as well as some basic firewall policies to get that traffic flowing, and of course security profiles, right, which involves your AV, content filtering, and IPS of the sorts. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead and move into our first part. So part 1, setting up a basic Azure network. Okay. This is really going to cover, selecting your location, whether that be West US, Central US, because again, there are multiple regions available to you, different data centers, right? Touching on resource groups, these are logical containers for your Azure objects to actually live in, and helps you to organize that. Virtual networks, address spaces, subnets, this is all a part of the network within Azure, and it will look very similar to your typical on-prem. The difference is that, we're not going to be dealing with things like VLANs, right? And then last here would be network security groups. So I'm mainly going to touch on this just to show what that process looks like. And typically in a deployment where you are not using a NG firewall appliance to secure the environment, you're leaning completely on these network security groups to secure your network. And I just mainly want to show you because, as your network scales up and you need more and more security policies put in place, the NSG can really blow out of proportion and really get to a level of complexity that it makes it really difficult to troubleshoot, right? And that's where the NG firewall comes into play to make that process more seamless. All right. So jumping into the actual session here, first thing I'm going to do is actually sign into our Azure tenant. And you may or may not already have your own setup. That's fine. For those of you that do have an Azure tenant and have access, this should look pretty familiar to you. Okay. So once I get into the account here, first thing I'll do is set up my actual virtual network. That's located on the left-hand side here. Once I click on that, you're going to see, other virtual networks that we are currently using here at Akins. But what I'm going to do is deploy a brand new virtual network for this demo, okay? So I just click Add. And, I can name it whatever I want. So in this case here, I'm just going to call it like demo_vnet, right, for my virtual network. The address space, that should be something within the range or outside of the range of your on-prem or your existing networks, because you don't want that to overlap, okay? So in this case here, I'm going to set mine to, let's say, 10.100.0.0/16. So that's way out of our range. Next, here's the actual resource group. So again, it's just a logical container. So I'm going to create a new one. Just going to call it like demo resource group. Should be easy enough. Then, of course, my location. So here you have several to choose from. I'm going to choose Central US. And for my first subnet, I'm going to call it my outside transport, right? That might sound like a lot, but really all it's doing is it's going to assign this first subnet to the outside or the WAN interface on my virtual NG firewall, okay? So again, this is all carved out of that address space that I specified up top. So it's always going to be 10.100, 10, 10.120, 10.100, so on and so on and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and create that. I'll just give it a couple of seconds here to actually deploy. And this is all deploying into my resource group, okay? So later on, I can reference that resource group and see everything that I deployed right in that container. So here I refresh, I will now have my demo VNet. And you can see there my resource group. If I drill into that, from here, you can see up top my actual address space. And then from this point, I can actually start carving out those smaller subnets, right, to segment, so to speak, my virtual network. Gateway subnet, we're not going to use that. That's mainly used for what's called a virtual network gateway. It's Azure's VPN offering, but we're not using that here since we're going to use the NG firewall for that, okay? So my next subnet will be my inside. So this is much like your LAN segment, right? The LAN interface of or the inside interface of your on-prem firewall. I'm not going to use any network security groups. Routing table right now, we'll leave that empty because I'm actually going to use that later in the next segments. So I'm going to go and hit OK. We'll give that a couple of seconds to deploy here. Now you'll see my second subnet, and then I'm just going to deploy two more, right? So I'm going to create one for, let's say, server subnet A, and then I'm also going to have one for server subnet B. So this is kind of to simulate my different subnets on my network, right? So on your on-prem, these would be like different VLANs, okay? So I can essentially use server subnet A, let's say for my domain controllers in Azure, and internal resources. And then I can use, for example, like server subnet B, and this could be much like a DMZ on your on-prem. So again, I'll leave everything as is, hit OK. And in a couple of seconds here, I'll have my fourth subnet. So there we are. And so I created these, I made them large enough. You can carve out whatever size subnet you want. I mean, given the fact that we have so much available in the address space is a /16, that's over 65,000 different addresses I can make. So I can carve out smaller ones. So here I have all of my 4 subnets, and you'll notice on the right-hand side there, there's a column for security group, right? So this is where you would reference your NSG. So quickly, I'm going to deploy a network security group. This is just an object that you can get from the marketplace. I'll create that. I'm just going to give it some name. As far as the resource group, I'm going to throw it into the same resource group container I made earlier. Same location. I'll go ahead and create that. Okay, and once that deploys, we'll drill into it, and I'll show you a couple of ways to get to it. So there we are. You can see my NSG right there in the front, actually. But if I want to, I can search up top. You could do this for really any other object that you create as well. And you can see here, this is just kind of the default configuration for the network security group that I just created. I can also access it by going into the actual resource group, my demo resource group, and everything will appear in there as well. So right now I only have 2 objects, right? My VNet, virtual network, and my NSG. So here in the NSG, this is pretty similar to most firewall rules, right? Very, very basic, actually. It's just going to cover things like your source IP, your source port, destination IP, destination port. Once I add an actual rule here, I'm adding an inbound rule, and you can see it's just referencing source, destination, ports. There's nothing in there about applications, right? So you can't specify, Netflix traffic or Hulu or anything else that you want to create more logic from your actual traffic flow. So in this case here, I'm kind of restricted to just your basic firewall options, right? So allow, deny, and I can set the priority. And much just like a firewall, the way it flows, it's from top to bottom, okay? So your outbound security rules, they're going to look the exact same way. So I mean, you could just imagine, right? Here I would actually associate it with, this is how you apply to the actual VNet and subnet. So I mean, overall, you can see over time, if you have all these VMs that need different accesses coming in, going out, it can get pretty convoluted and overly complex. And again, especially when it comes to troubleshooting, that could be problematic, right? So here you can see I've applied the NSG to the actual VNet and subnet, okay? If I want to, I can apply it directly to the network interface of a VM. In this case here, I don't have any spun up yet, so there really isn't any available. Okay, so going back here, you can see the demo NSG being applied to the actual subnet there. Again, it's not doing anything. I don't have any policies in place, but that just kind of just to show you what that process looks like, okay? So there we are. So just to recap here for part 1, I selected my location, right? So central US, I've deployed my resource groups, my virtual network, carved out of that address space, that 10.100 address space, plus 4 subnets, and then of course touching on the actual network security group. Okay.